at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey.
From the Matrix Home Solutions studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy, the great Chicago reporter, humorist, Finley Peter Dunn, observed famously now that the job of the journalist is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. But it seems to me now, at least the D.C. press corps and its urban outposts in places like Chicago, the job is to comfort the comfortable and afflict the afflicted. That seems to me what's going on in journalism, but the question is why? Well, for an interesting take on it, we're pleased to be joined by Batya UngarSargon, who's a deputy opinion editor at Newsweek. She's got a new book, Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. We talked about her piece that was posted at Barry Weiss's Substack a little bit the other day, but now we have the source. Batya, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning, Dan. Good morning to all of your listeners. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. So what has happened to journalism? You really point to essentially a social strata, a class, and by extension, wealth, and that has significantly changed within the journalism profession over the last several generations, so that now journalists start out as part of the ruling class, if you will.
That's exactly right. We look at our media and we often talk about it like the problem with it is that it's politically polarized, or the problem with it is that we talk about race a lot. One side does, one side doesn't. And of course, those things are factors, but the source of the difference between conservative and liberal media today is not really race or politics, it's class. That's the argument I make in my book, that the reason that you might feel that contempt coming off of journalists increasingly is because they actually are part of the elites, and they actually do look down on everyday Americans and working class Americans because of a status revolution that journalists underwent throughout the 20th century. So it used to be, Dan, that a journalist was a working class job. It was a blue collar trade. In 1937, for example, they did a survey of the elite journalists who work in Washington, and less than half of them had a college degree. In fact, a lot of them hadn't even graduated high school. And if you fast forward to today, 2015, they did a study. You'll not believe how many journalists have a college degree. It's 92%. And with that status revolution, as we know, the economy is working really, really well for people in the knowledge industry. Over the last 20 years, journalists have become increasingly affluent. And now even to become a journalist, you have to actually really come from money, because the way that you get that job is to go to a really elite college as opposed to learning it on the job the way they once did. And so I argue that all this has contributed to the way that journalists really look at the rest of their fellow Americans, which is very much from a kind of almost ivory tower of journalism, as opposed to living amongst them and describing America, the America that you and I know.
Well, I worked in newsrooms for 21 years, and I have to tell you, what I noticed toward the end is that there's a lot of journalists, and especially a lot of meteorologists, who were acting majors who couldn't make it in acting, but they still wanted to be on TV, and they were good looking enough, so then they joined journalism. Did you discuss that at all in your book? I know it might be an ancillary issue, but it's a thing, I swear to God.
I did not discuss that, but that's hilarious, Amy. Oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. I was focused more on people who, there is a sort of, I think there's a sense among journalists that was described by a lot of conservative intellectuals like 30 years ago, that their liberal counterparts, felt that they deserved more power and more money than they were getting. They didn't understand why, politicians and corporate lawyers were making more than them. And I think that there is a lot of resentment among journalists today, but it's really, the funnel to becoming a journalist is really narrowed with the collapse of local newspapers. So it used to be, you would, like I said, you'd pick up the job on the job. Your editor would probably be someone who hadn't gone to college. His boss would probably be a Republican, right? That's kind of how the local news industry operated. And so even though journalists have always been slightly more liberal than the rest of Americans, there was, a countervailing force, right, pulling in the other direction towards a more moderate point of view. And today, because of digital journalism, right, digital journalism rewards high emotion. It rewards extreme engagement. And so the journalists now are increasingly far left on issues of identity because they've all been elite educated at Ivy League colleges. And the business end is pushing them to indulge in these sort of woke opinions because it's good for business, unfortunately.
Yeah, and so I just wanted to, a couple of points there I wanted to develop a little bit more. Going from the days of the copy boy at the Daily Planet who works his way up, I mean, those days are gone. And part of the power they saw came with the advent of the cable news networks and 24-hour televised news, and then all these journalists, whether they're technically reporters or they're columnists, it's hard to distinguish between the two anymore. They become part of these roundtable discussions. So then they get their own celebrity and they get their own book deals and they get their own contributor salaries on these networks. And so it becomes this cottage industry of a very small group of people who all basically have about the same intellect, which is not a compliment, and went to most of the same schools and studied, at some of the weaker disciplines at those schools, whether it be education or journalism. The social sciences, not anything. You don't have a lot of mechanical engineers running around as journalists, for example.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, we're having this whole conversation about critical race theory in schools, right? And something you'll notice is journalists going, well, that's not critical race theory. There's no critical race theory in K through 12, right? And that phrase, there's no critical race theory in K through 12, they are using their highly educated, very specialized language and their familiarity with this academic concept to browbeat parents and essentially be like, you don't know what critical race theory is. I know what critical race theory is.
Right.
You don't get to criticize the schools. You don't know enough. I know enough. You know what I mean? It's so gross.
Well, gross. Yeah, it is. And the other thing, the business model you mentioned. See, I think some people say, the advent of Trump brought about this opportunity to go hard left as a counterbalance to Trump. And this is why the CNN saw its viewership spike and the New York Times saw its subscriber spike. Now, what actually has been happening, I think you sort of memorialized this, is over time with these individuals controlling so many other elite institutions and now the Fourth Estate too, is you have essentially a bunch of people who think like you, who've had the same lived experience, 2/3 of the country that goes to colleges, and particularly the smaller subset that goes to elite colleges. That becomes your subscriber base. And so now all you're doing, because you've created this environment, you've created this community around this content, you're just feeding this subscriber base. So the business model works, and then it radiates out from this insular circle of very alike people intellectually and in terms of ideology, and it sort of radiates out like a cancer and starts to infect the rest of the countryside, and it metastasizes, and that's sort of what how I inartfully describe it.
That's exactly right. The question I sought to answer with my book was, I know that these ideas about identity, about intersectionality, ideas like open borders, the mission creep of what counts as racist, right? I know that these are niche ideas that were cooked up in the Ivy League. How is it that suddenly not just the New York Times, not just the Washington Post, but the Atlantic and Vox and every single outlet is now catering to people who believe this? Where does the market come from when I know that the vast majority of Americans think that this is malarkey? Why is it that all of the liberal publications and outlets are now obsessing over it? And by the way, it's not just me who's saying they're obsessed with these issues of identity that are sort of academic. Sociologists have tracked it, and you're absolutely right, Dan. It started long before the Trump administration. What they did was they trawled the archives of the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR, and they found that around 2012, there began to be an absolute skyrocketing of uses of words like racism, slavery, Islamophobia, transphobia, this total revolution, just an absolute obsession that has become today a moral panic about racism, Of course, there are areas where racism still exists. I know you agree with me about that. Areas that we absolutely need to talk about, areas that we absolutely need to be focused on. But this is not that. This is not saying, look, there's a problem with this. There's a problem with education. There's a problem with policing. This is an outright obsession. The use of words just over and over and over. And it created a feedback loop with a highly educated, affluent, liberal subset, which is the target audience of all of these publications, where their views shifted to where they now see racism more than black people. They now see white liberals see it more than Latino people, and it's the feedback loop with the media, where the media was catering to this highly affluent set, and this highly affluent set then sort of gave this feedback loop where they gave them their business in exchange for reading about white supremacy every day, right? That's the feedback loop that I describe, and I try to analyze why that happened in the book.
Do you analyze too how the media was so obsessed with President Trump? I mean, Don Lemon, remember he hosted a panel discussion with white women who voted for Donald Trump for no apparent reason. There was no need for that.
I talk about how the media treated Donald Trump a lot, because the funny thing about Donald Trump is that his economic agenda was compiled of things that Bernie Sanders had been talking about in 2015. So think about it, right? Bernie Sanders in 2015 was talking about the need for border control to protect working class jobs. Bernie Sanders was talking about getting rid of NAFTA, which President Trump did. Bernie Sanders was talking about a trade war with China and tariffs. This was socialist stuff in 2015 that President Trump did, and nobody would talk about it, right? The Republicans couldn't talk about it because they believe in trickle-down economics. They don't like this stuff. And the Democrats couldn't talk about it because they couldn't say a nice word about Trump, even when he was doing what I consider to be a very good left-wing economic policy, right? So, yes, the media was completely obsessed with him. And I'll just give your listeners one more statistic. So they were so obsessed with him that in 2017, his name appeared in the New York Times 97,000 times, which is the equivalent of twice every article, every 250 words. That's the equivalent of that. Right. Now, you might think, okay, maybe that's just normal for a president, right? That's how many times President Obama, in his second year in term, guess how many times his name appeared? 37,000 times. Literally an increase of 60,000 times. Why? Because they are catering to the emotions of highly educated, affluent liberals. So what makes highly educated, affluent liberals emotional? Racism and Trump. And those are the two things you're going to see over and over in the New York Times, because it's a model built on catering to emotion, on engagement. It's just like Facebook. It's become just like Facebook, essentially.
Well, and we'll have a discussion about economics another time, but pre-Trump and as well as post-Trump, it'll go back to what it was previously. It seems to me what you have is a lot of 60s hippies that went to these colleges, got into these institutions, and they found identity in part in the civil rights movement, which of course was legitimate. But they wanted to keep that identity. They want to be that we're righteous, we're saviors. And so they use black and brown people as sort of mascots, as you say, in this feedback loop, to continue propagating a vision of America that is no longer reflects what America was in 1963, but they want to keep that. So it's the solidarity and marginality game. We have to find where racism doesn't exist. We're going to find it because we need supply, because our demand is insatiable. And so this is what they do. And it's the next marginalized community, black, brown, then it's going to be by sexual orientation, then it's by sexual identity, and so on and so forth.
I think that affluent white liberals use the real pain of black Americans to call America a white supremacy and then withdraw from the common good, withdraw from the idea that they owe their fellow citizens anything. Like, so instead of working together with Senator Tim Scott on his police reform bill, something that we desperately need, right? Senator Scott was pulled over 17 times in 1 year, the year he got a new car, right? He knows that we need police reform. Instead of working with him, they call for defunding the police, right? Mm-hmm. They call for policies that flatter their egos, that black people are going to bear the burden of, that will result in more murder, in more black victimization, in more crime. There's a taboo on talking about crime because they're embarrassed by it. And they'd rather sit there and get high on their own virtue than actually help the black community. It's so infuriating.
It's a great way to sum it. Batya Ungar-Sargon, she's the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek. Pick up her new book, Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Batya, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book.